Chapter 8. Wheel and turn, or bleed and burn, fly between blue and green, soar, dive down, bronze and brown, dragon men must fly when threads are in the sky. As it turned out, Elemi sailed Elgian to the Dragonstones to search there for the elusive fire lizards. One windy day, not long after the visit of Natan, the young seaman broke a leg bone when the rough seas tossed him against the pilot house of his ship. They were coming into harbor, and the high tide made for heavier waters than he'd expected. Yanis grumbled a good deal about Elemi being too experienced a seaman to get injured, but his grumbling subsided when Mavi pointed out that here was a chance to see if Elemi's first mate would be capable of assuming command of the ship, being finished in the building cavern. Elemi tried to take the injury in good part, but after 4 days in bed, with the swelling eased, he was heartily bored and restless. He plagued Mavi so constantly that she handed him the crutch she had not meant to give him for a full 7 days more, and suggested that if he broke his neck too, he would only have himself to blame. Elemi had more sense than that and navigated the inner stairways, narrow and dark, slowly and carefully. He kept to the wider outer stairs and the Seahold's main rooms, and the holdways whenever possible. While he had some mobility, he didn't have much activity if the fishing fleet was out, so he was soon attracted by the sound of the children learning a new ballad from the harper. He caught Elgian's eye and received a courteous wave to enter the little hall. If the children were startled to hear a baritone suddenly take up the learning, they had too much respect for the harper to do more than hazard a quick peek, and the class progressed. To Elemi's pleasure, he found himself as quick to memorize the new words and tune as the youngsters, and he thoroughly enjoyed the session. He was almost sorry when Elgian excused them. "How's the leg, Elemi?" the harper asked when the room had emptied. "I'll have a weatherwise ache now, for sure." "Is that why you did it?" Elgian said with a broad grin. "I'd heard you wanted to be sure Tilsit got a chance at command." Elemi let out a snort of laughter. "Nonsense. I haven't had a rest since the last 5-day gale. That's a fine ballad you're teaching." "That's a fine voice you were singing it with, too. Why don't you sound out more often? I was beginning to think the sea wind snatches the voice of everyone in about 12 turns." "You should have heard my And Elemi stopped, flushed, and clamped his lips tight. "Which reminds me, I took the liberty of asking Natan, Lyoth's rider, to spread the word at Ben and Weir that she's missing. She may still be alive, you know." Elemi nodded slowly. "You sea-holders are full of surprises," said Elgian, thinking to switch to a less painful topic. He went to the racks of wax tablets and removed the 2 he sought. "These must have been done by that fosterling who took over when Paterian died. The other slates are all in the older script notations, which the old harper used, but these... A lad who can do this sort of work is needed in the harper's craft. You don't know where the boy is now, do you?" Elemi was torn between duty to the hold and love of his sister. But she wasn't in the hold any more, and common sense told Elemi that she must be dead if, in this length of time, with dragon riders looking for her, she hadn't been found. Manoli was only a girl, so what good did it do that her songs found favor with the harper? Elemi was also reluctant to put the lie to his father, so, despite the fact that Elgian was impressed by the songs, since the songmaker was beyond them, Elemi answered truthfully that he didn't know where he was. Elgian wrapped the wax slates carefully, and with a noticeable sigh of regret, "I'll send them on to the Harper Craft Hall anyway. Robinson will want to use them." "Use them? They're that good?" Elemi was startled and regretted the lie still more. "They're cracking good. Maybe if the lad hears them, he'll come forward on his own." Elgian gave Elemi a rueful smile, "since it's obvious there's some reason you can't name him." He chuckled at the seaman's reaction. "Come now, man, the lad was sent away in some sort of disgrace, wasn't he? That happens, as any harper worth his salt knows, and understands. Hold honor and all that. I won't tease you any more. He'll surface to the sound of his own music." They talked of other things then until the fishing fleet returned. 2 men of the same age but different background, one with an inquisitive interest in the world beyond his sea-hold, and the other quite willing to satisfy it. Elgian was, in fact, delighted to find none of Yanis's denseness and inflexibility in Elemi, and the harper began to feel that after all he might be able to follow Master Robinson's ambitious plan of broadening understanding beyond the limits of this sea-hold. Elemi was back the following day after the children had been dismissed with more questions. He stopped mid-sentence finally, apologizing profusely for taking so much of Elgian's time. I'll tell you what, Alemi. I'll teach you what you'd like to know if you'll teach me how to sail. Teach you to sail? Elgian grinned. Yes, teach me to sail. The smallest child in my class knows more about that than I do, and my professional standing is in jeopardy. After all, a harper is supposed to know everything. I may be wrong, but I can't imagine that you need both legs to sail one of those little skiffs the children use. Alemi's face lit up, and he pounded the harper on the back with enthusiasm. Of course I can! By the first shell, man, I'd be glad to do it. Glad! And nothing would satisfy Alemi but to take the harper down to the dock cavern immediately and give him the fundamentals of seamanship. In his own subject, Alemi was as good an instructor as the harper, and Elgian was able to tack across the harbor by himself by the end of the first lesson. Of course, as Alemi remarked, the wind was from the right quarter and the sea calm, ideal sailing conditions. Which rarely prevail, asked Elgian, and he was rewarded by Alemi's tolerant chuckle. Well, practice makes perfect, and I'd better learn the practical. And the theory. So their friendship was cemented by mutual exchanges of knowledge and long visits together. Although their conversation touched many subjects, Elgian hesitated to bring up the subject of fire lizards, or the fact that the weir had asked him to search for traces of the elusive little creatures. He had, however, searched as much of the accessible coastline as he could on foot. There were some beaches that should be checked now from the seaside. With Alemi teaching him how to handle the skiff, he hoped he'd soon be able to do it himself. Elgian knew with certainty that Yanis would be completely scornful of any search for fire lizards, and the harper didn't want to indicate Alemi in any plan that would bring Yanis's anger down on his head. Alemi was in bad enough straits over breaking his leg. One clear, bright morning, Elgian decided to put his solution to the test. He dismissed the children early, then sought out Alemi and suggested that today was not only a fine day, but the sea was rough enough to test his ability. Alemi laughed, cast a wise eye at the clouds, and said that it would be mild as a bathing pool by afternoon, but that the practice now would be useful to Elgian's progress. Elgian wheedled a large package of fish rolls and spice cakes from Kitchen Auntie, and the two men set off. Alemi was agile enough now with his crutch and splint-bound leg on land, but he was glad of any excuse to be on the sea. Once beyond the protecting arms of the half-circle cliffs, the sea was choppy with cross-current and wind. Elgian's skill would be well tested. Alemi, disregarding an occasional wetting as the skiff plunged in and out of the wave troughs, played silent passenger while the harper fought tiller and sheet to keep them on course. On the course Alemi had set down the coast. The seaman became aware of the wind shift some moments before Elgian, but it was the mark of his abilities as a teacher that Elgian was quick enough to notice the change. Wind slacking off. Alemi nodded, adjusting his cap slightly for the wind's new direction. They sailed on, the wind slackening to a gentle pressure against the sail, the skiff's speed aided more by the deep current than the wind. I'm hungry, Alemi announced as he and Elgian saw the stumpy violet crags of the Dragonstones to leeward. Elgian released the sheet line, and Alemi pulled the sail down, furling it with absent skill against the boom. At his direction, Elgian lashed the tiller so that the current carried them idly down coast. Don't know why, Alemi said through a mouthful of fish roll. Food always tastes better on the sea. Elgian contented himself to a nod since his mouth was full. He also had a good appetite. Not, he qualified to himself, that he had been working over hard, just hanging on to the tiller and adjusting the sail sheet now and then. Come to think, don't often have time to eat on the sea, Alemi added. He gestured to include their leisurely bobbing, the skiff itself, and the informal meal. Haven't been this lazy on a sail since I was old enough to haul a net. He stretched and then adjusted his splinted legs slightly, grimacing against the awkwardness and discomfort. Suddenly, he leaned away from the bulwark to reach into the small locker fitted against the curve of the hull. Thought so. Grinning, he held up fish line, hook, and dry worm. Can't you leave off? What, and have Yanis give out about unproductive hands? Alemi deftly threaded line to hook and baited it. Here, you might as well try hook, line, and bait, or does the master harper object to cross-crafting? The more crafts the better, says Master Robinson. Alemi nodded, his eyes on the current. Aye, sending lads away to other sea-holds for fostering doesn't quite answer, does it? Deftly he threw the line from him, watching the cast carry it well away from the drifting skiff and sink. Elgian gave a fair imitation of that cast and settled himself, as Alemi had, to wait for results. What would we be catching out here? Alemi drew his mouth up in a grimace of indifference. Probably nothing. Tide's full. Current strong, midday. Fish feed at dawn unless there's thread. Is that why you use the dry worm? Because it resembles thread? Elgin couldn't suppress the shudder that went down his spine at the thought of loose thread. You're right. The silence that often grips fishermen settled comfortably in the boat. Yellow stripe, if anything, Alemi finally said in answer to the question that Elgin had almost forgotten he'd asked. Yellow stripe or a very hungry packtail. They'll eat anything. Packtail? That's good eating. Line'll break. Packtail's too heavy for this. Oh. The current was inexorably drawing them closer to the Dragonstones, but although he wanted to get Alemi talking about them, Elgin couldn't find the proper opening. At about the point where Elgin felt he'd better speak or they'd be pulled by the current into the stones, Alemi glanced casually around. They were only several dragon lengths from the most seaward of the great crags. The water now lapped peacefully against the base, exposing occasionally the jagged points of submerged rock, eddying around others. Alemi unfurled the sail and hauled on the sheet line. We need more sea room near those. Dangerous with sunken rock. When the tide's making, current can pull you right in. If you sail this way by yourself, and you'll soon be able to, make sure you keep your distance. The lads say you saw fire lizards there once. Elgin found the words out of his mouth before he could censor them. Alemi shot him a long, amused look. Let's say I can't think what else it could have been. They weren't wherries. Too fast, too small, and wherries can't maneuver that way. But fire lizards? He laughed and shrugged his shoulders, indicating his own skepticism. What if I told you that there are such things? That Fnor, Kant's rider, impressed one in Southern, and so did 5 or 6 other riders. That the weirs are looking for more fire lizard clutches, and I've been asked to search the beaches. Alemi stared at the harper. Then the skiff rocked in the subtle cross currents. Mind now, pull the tiller hard to port. No, to your left, man. They had the looming Dragonstone comfortably abaft before further conversation. You can impress fire lizards? If Alemi's voice was incredulous, an eager light sparkled in his eyes, and Elgin knew he'd made an ally. He told as much as he himself knew. Well, that would explain why you rarely see grown ones, and why they evade capture so cleverly. They hear you coming. Alemi laughed, shaking his head. When I think of the times. Me too, Elgin grinned broadly, remembering his boyhood attempts to rig a successful trap. We're to look on beaches? That's what Natan suggested. Sandy beaches, sheltered places, preferably hard for small active boys to find. There are plenty of places where a fire lizard queen could hide a clutch around here. Not with the tide so high this season. There must be some beaches deep enough. Elgin felt impatient with Alemi's arguments. The seaman motioned Elgin out of the tiller seat and deftly tacked about. I saw fire lizards about the Dragonstones, and those crags would be right good weirs. Not that I think we'd have a chance of seeing them today. They feed at dawn. That's when I saw them, only... And Alemi chuckled. I thought my eyes were deceiving me since it was the end of a long watch, and a man's eyes can play tricks with him at dawn. Alemi sailed the little skiff far closer to the Dragonstones than Elgin would have dared. In fact, the harper found himself gripping the weatherboard very hard and edging his body away from the towering crags as the skiff breezed lightly by. There was no doubt that the crags were riddled with holes, likely weirs for fire lizards. I wouldn't try this tack except when the tide is full, Elgin, said Alemi, as they sailed between the innermost crag and the tide-washed land. There's a right mess of bottom-reaming rocks here, even at half-tide. It was quiet, too, with the waves softly caressing the narrow verge of sand between sea and cliff. Quiet enough for the unmistakable sound of piping to carry across the water to Elgin. Did you hear that? Elgin grabbed Alemi's arm. Hear what? The music. What music? Alemi wondered briefly if the sun were strong enough to give the harper a stroke, but he sharpened his ears for any unusual sound, following the line of Elgin's stare to the cliffs. His heart leapt for a moment, but he said, Music? Nonsense. Those cliffs are riddled with caves and holes. All you hear is the wind. There isn't any wind now. Alemi had to admit that because he'd let the boom out and was even beginning to wonder if they had enough wind to come about on a tack that would clear the northern side of the stones. And look, said Elgin, there's a hole in the cliff face. Big enough for a person to get into, I'd wager. Alemi, can't we go inshore? Not unless we walk home or wait for high tide again. Alemi, that's music, not wind over blowholes. That's someone playing pipes. An unhappy, furtive thought crossed Elemi's face so plainly that Elgian jumped to a conclusion. All at once, all the pieces fell into place. Your sister, the one who's missing, she wrote those songs. She taught the children, not that conveniently dismissed fosterling. Manoli's not playing any pipes, Elgian. She sliced her left hand, gutting packtail, and she can't open or close her fingers.
She can't now?
Elgian sank back to the deck, stunned but still hearing the clear tone of pipes. Pipes? You'd need 2 whole hands to play multiple pipes. The music ceased, and the wind, rising as they tacked past the Dragonstones, covered his memory of that elusive melody. It could have been the land breeze sweeping down over the cliffs, sounding into holes. Manoli did teach the children, didn't she? Slowly, Elemi nodded. Yanis believed the Seahold disgraced to have a girl taking the place of a harper. Disgraced? Once again, Elgian was appalled at the obtuseness of the Seaholder. When she taught so well? When she can turn a tune like the ones I've seen? She can play no more, Elgian. It would be cruel to ask now. She wouldn't even sing in the evening. She'd leave as soon as you started to play. So he'd been right, thought Elgian. The tall girl had been Manoli. If she's alive, she's happier away from the hold. If she's dead... Elemi didn't continue. In silence they sailed on, the Dragonstones falling away back into violent indefiniteness as each man avoided the other's gaze. Now Elgian could understand many things about Manoli's disappearance and the general reluctance at the hold to discuss her or find her. There was no doubt in his mind that her disappearance was deliberate. Anyone sensitive enough to compose such melodies must have found life in the Seahold intolerable, doubly so with Yanis as Seaholder and father. And then to be considered a disgrace! Elgian cursed Batarian for not making the matter plain. If only he had told Robinton that the promising musician were a girl, she might have been at the Harper Hall before that knife had a chance to slip. There'd be no clutches on the Dragonstone's coves, Elemi said, breaking into Elgian's rueful thoughts. Water's right up to the bluff at high tide. There is one place. I'll take you there after the next threadfall is past. A good long day's sail down the coast. You can impress a fire lizard, you say? I'll set the signal for Natan to talk to you after fall. Elgian was happy enough to use any subject to break the restraint that had fallen between them. Evidently you or I can impress, though lowly harpers and young seamen may be far down on the list for available eggs. By the dawn star, when I think of the hours I spent as a small fellow... Who hasn't? Elgian grinned back, eager too for the chance. This time their silence was companionable, and when they exchanged glances it was for remembered boyish fancies of capturing the elusive and much-desired fire lizards. As they tacked into the dock cavern late that afternoon, Elemi had a final word for Elgian. You understand why you're not to know it was Manoli who did the teaching? The Seahold is not disgraced. Elgian felt Elemi's hand tighten on his arm, so he nodded. But I would never betray that confidence. If his solemn response reassured the seaman, it reinforced Elgian's determination to find out who had made that pipe music. Was it possible to play multiple pipes with one hand? He was convinced that he'd heard music, not wind over blowholes. Somehow, whether on the pretext of searching for fire lizards or not, he must get close enough to examine that cave in the Dragonstone's cove. The next day was rainy, a thin, soft drizzle that did not deter the fishermen, but that made both Elgian and Elemi unwilling to take a long and possibly fruitless journey in an open boat. That same evening, Yanis asked Elgian to excuse the children from lessons the following morning, as they'd be needed to gather seaweed for the smoke cave. Elgian granted considered permission, masterfully suppressing a desire to thank the Seaholder for a free day, and determined to rise early and be off to seek the answer to the music mystery. He was up as soon as the sun, first in the Great Hall, so they had to unbar the metal doors, little realizing as he did so that he would be following an unnerving precedent. With fish rolls and dried fruit in his pouch, his own pipe slung across his back, a stout rope about his middle, for he rather thought he might need it climbing down that cliff face, Elgian was away.